number 41 was the second hearing for the adoption of an ordinance called the Tampa Comprehensive Plan, pertaining to land usage. Sounds pretty boring, right?
Absolutely.
Here's why it's important. The city council was voting on adopting the language to include this provision, modifying policy language, directing the Tampa Police Department to focus on neighborhood crime and drug activity.
So you're telling me that right now, our city council leaders voted in favor of directing more police into neighborhoods for drug activity. Now, in 2021, I would have thought we have learned something, but it seems as though we have learned nothing from the protests that occurred last year.
The fact is, policing's not going to solve the problems, and it's not designed to. This is why refunding the community is so critical. The good news is, they did strike through some very, very problematic objectives in this plan. There was going to be language in there directing policing to target specific areas and even to work with code enforcement to identify crack houses and gangs.
In 2021, when we are facing a housing crisis, there are people still trying to go into low-income Black and brown communities and saying things like crack houses. They're never worried about the quote-unquote cocaine houses in Bayshore. Yeah, South Tampa, I'm looking at you. We know. But yeah, I agree. I'm happy they struck out the obvious dog whistle language, but sadly, the new version they voted on still contains punitive language that we know will target low-income Black and brown communities in Tampa.
Right, the new language is definitely softer, but still calls for policing crime and drug neighborhoods. And by now, we all know what that means. That's not what the people need. Evidence overwhelmingly shows that policing does not curb drug addiction, and addiction is a serious problem in low-income, marginalized communities and or LGBTQ communities. But not because people in these communities are bad people or weak people, but because of systemic injustices people in these communities face.
The war on drugs escalated in the 1980s and since then has cost us lives, largely Black lives, and devastated gay, queer, and trans communities. According to DrugSense, over 300,000 U.S. residents have been arrested this year alone for drug-related offenses, and 156,000 individuals were specifically arrested for cannabis. In 2021 so far, over $7 billion has been spent on this war, according to DrugSense. It is only the beginning of March, and this is the direction we're going in.
And although evidence has shown white communities actually participate in more drug usage on average than Black communities, that isn't reflected in arrest records. This is one reason why we have such a disparity between the races in our prison system.
With those stark numbers, we can tell plainly that this drug war isn't solving the drug problem. Of course, that's not what it's ever been intended to do. If City Council wants to actually solve the drug crisis for everyone, not just the opioid crisis in white communities, then they need to take a different approach. They could advocate for walk-in judgment-free addiction harm reduction and recovery centers in our neighborhoods. They could look at needle exchange programs. Mayor Castor could give a directive to not perform any arrests, notice to appears, or citations for drug-related offenses. The cycle of arresting drug users has not made any of us any safer. In fact, only creates more barriers for these individuals to find work, housing in the future, making their problems even worse. On top of that, in Tampa, in 2014, 29-year-old Jason Westcott was murdered in Seminole Heights in his own home in front of his boyfriend due to a drug raid over less than $2 worth of cannabis. This was under Mayor Jane Castor's watch, and she obviously hasn't learned anything.
This is why it's so critical that you get on the phone every week and have this dialogue with your city council member. Since all of them voted in favor of this language, except Citro, who was absent at the vote. We saw them give TPD an additional $13 million more last year, despite the cries of the people. So we know that they can fund harm reduction and non-punitive programs, but they need to have it demanded of them, and often.